So right now I would like to introduce Nancy and Lorraine. Their work around gender transformative practice, particularly in making it better around gender transformative health promotion, and now with their book, Gender Untrained, Stories from the Gender Equality Frontier, that work in their thinking and that movement. So they've come here from Canada to be able to share with us. They come to Australia a lot. Many of you have maybe attended sessions with them before. They like to come down, so we're very lucky to have them here today from the Centre of Excellence in Women's Health in British Columbia. So please, I welcome you today to moderate our panel, our Men and Masculinities panel, and get our day going. So here's
great. Well, we're really excited. And you know, our favorite thing is this kind of opportunity to do some critical thinking together. So this promises to be a perfect location for that. So we're having a panel right now, and let us have our panelists come up. We have Cara Busst, who's with VicHealth, as many of you probably know, who's worked on the Healthier Masculinities framework. We have Regina Quiazon, who's working with men from migrant and refugee communities from the Multicultural Center for Women's Health. I have to read it because I don't want to make a mistake on the names. Claire, you've just had a chance to be introduced to, who has done this amazing work with Women's Health Victoria. And Shane, we had a great opportunity to connect with yesterday. Shane Tass from Our Watch, who's worked on the Men in Focus research and paper. And last but not least is Matt Taylor from the Jesuit Social Services, who's worked on the Man Box research. And so they're going to have some fun now, if you can call this fun. They're going to pose some really interesting questions to each other and have a bit of a dialogue about it. So there's 5 questions, and we have 10 minutes a question, and it should be a really interesting thing. So Regina, do you want to kick it off with question 1?
So maybe I'll just read it out because it probably will require a translation. So we have a growing body of research that deconstructs masculinities and offers alternatives to the dominant or hegemonic masculinity prevalent in Australia. However, better understanding of men and masculinities and the initiatives grounded in this research may not lead to or aid in the dismantling of the patriarchy. How do we make sure our work on men and masculinities is also working towards dismantling patriarchy? So I guess what I was thinking here, I don't have the answers for this obviously, is what's it all for? Why are we here? And I think the genesis for this question was really, I attended the Broadside Feminist Festival of Ideas, and some of you may have attended that a couple of weeks ago, and I was surprised at the resurgence of the word patriarchy. And I guess coming from having attended uni during kind of third wave feminism and being told you don't use the patriarchy because it actually kind of universalizes and really doesn't get into the specificities of what we're talking about in terms of power relations. How has it, I mean, it's great, I think, that it's had a resurgence, but how can we actually then, I guess, hold on to the idea of smashing the patriarchy when we all know already that there are other things like capitalism that may be just as insidious. So that's my question.
Just in response quickly, I went to Bob Pease's book launch as well, who also was concerned that we weren't using the language, and that was there as well, patriarchy. And perhaps the first thing to think about is because we use a gender inequality model and how they're different was something that came up. Are we saying that it is something different? Does using patriarchy and conceptualising the system in that way do something different to then just talking about gender inequality at all the levels of society? So I think that's an interesting first point. How are they different? But I mean, the answer, I don't have an answer either, but I think perhaps the first thing is to think about intersectionality. Firstly, because if we think about, say, some key theorists like Raymond Connell, who coined hegemonic masculinity, that she says patriarchy works in a very particular way. It's not just the power relations between men and women, but it's also between men as well, and that is a strategy in a way to divide men, and so that only really one group of men or a particular group of men are reaping the most rewards and benefits and privileges. So definitely to keep that in mind, first of all, that when we do this work that we have to be thinking about the hierarchy amongst men as well, and the way that's part of the strategy.
I guess, even to simplify the question even more, what do we think about when we do, say the word the patriarchy? What first comes to mind?
I guess for me, I guess it's the thing about language and how we use language to get people on board with what we want to achieve. And patriarchy seems like it's a bit of a not well received word. And I think that's one of the challenges that Natalie, Russell and I discuss a lot in our work on masculinity, is how we use language to frame issues so that we can get people on board with the outcomes that we want to achieve in terms of gender equity. I guess the whole thing is about achieving health equity for everybody, equality of outcomes, and using whatever approach that we can do to actually get there.
And I think I agree that, I think some of it is doing the work around bringing people back to what we actually mean when we talk about the patriarchy and the system that we're talking about, and making people aware of when we use this word, which we see on t-shirts and which we see on the internet and people share it on Instagram, what is that actually talking about? And linking that system to other systems of inequity, and showing how that those are structures that we all exist within. And that impact all of us in both an individual and collective sense. So I think some of that work around not necessarily reclaiming the word, but bringing it back into usage, is making people really aware of when we actually talk about the patriarchy, what does that look like, and how does that impact on everybody in society? What does that look like on an individual level? What does that look like on a structural level? How does that support other systems of inequity as well, so that we're actually bringing our focus back to why that word has been used in the past, and how it is still relevant for us to be using it now.
Yeah, I think, Regina, to your question, when I think about patriarchy, I think about unequal access to power. And the work we do with, and I think also to say that the premise in your question is right. We can do a lot of work on challenging and decreasing adherence to stereotypical ideas of masculinities, and not make any progress on smashing patriarchy. So I think that's the first thing to call out, that's true. I think the second thing to say is that when we're working with men and boys across different contexts, is we start with acknowledging the patriarchy. And our starting point is to say that work to decrease adherence to stereotypical masculine norms is about gender equality. Historically, men and women have had unequal access to power. And I think that when I share a story of how that's impacted my mum, and in the 1980s she couldn't get access to financing for a car without the signature of a man, people start, I think it takes an abstract concept to the concrete pretty quickly, and then from there we'll bridge to, and there are unequal expectations that are placed on men because of their sex. And that has a negative impact on men as well. But I think before getting there, acknowledging that there continues to be unequal access to power in a range of economic, political ways, cultural ways, and so calling that out, but then bridging to this work. And just one other thing, I think there's aspects of this work that have the potential to challenge the patriarchy, and I'm thinking here about the breadwinner aspects of masculinity's work. I think if we're challenging that idea that a man has to bring home money, it wouldn't be manly to cook, sew, or clean. I think that naturally has the potential, at least, to have to make some progress on issues around patriarchy.
And I also think, although it isn't enough, so you can change masculinities in terms of making it more accessible for certain men to do the housework or to stay at home, but if we don't change the social conditions in which men are actually doing that work, they're going to be just as frazzled as women.
Right.
So I think that's the issue. But I think, Cara, you had touched on it as well. I think it's great to be in a room full of like-minded souls in terms of the work that we need to do, but I think we also need to be very careful about how we use the term patriarchy. And I'm thinking about, the Sky News people, conservatives like Mark Latham and Andrew Bolt and et cetera, won't name anymore, who may think, hey, this is an attack, using the patriarchy is almost used as a rallying cry by, wild feminists. And we have to hang on to this sense of what's wrong with the patriarchy. I think, there are lots of good things about the patriarchy that we should hold on to. So I think it's also, we need to be very careful about how we use the term, but I think we can all agree that it's that specificity and actually calling out what it is we want to fix in order to fix it.
And I guess also the work on masculinity can't happen alone. Like, you have to also put all of the other aspects of gender equality, not just masculinity.
Yeah, and then also all the attention to all the other systems and structures of power, because we know, we know that even in the past, that when we just focus on patriarchy without thinking about all these other systems, adopting a truly intersectional approach, that wasn't enough either to do the job.
And it does highlight the fact, I guess, that very dynamic, that very relational aspect to the work that we do in terms of gender transformative approaches and intersectional approaches, that using the word patriarchy in the 1970s is going to be very different to how we use it now in the #MeToo movement, because yes, it is used more now as a kind of a rallying cry, but I think in terms of the work that we are doing now, we know enough to know that it can actually be used as a very incisive analytical tool in terms of saying, well, the task ahead of us is very complex. Let's start the forensics on it now, so it's not just the rallying cry of 1970s feminism, for example.
Great, thank you. Perfect way to end that 10 minutes. So thanks a lot for that question. Let's go to the next one. Whose question is this?
This was mine, I think. This comes up, I'm sure all of you know this comes up all the time. But the question is, to be gender transformative, we should also be challenging the binary-driven framing that is often present in our work on gender equality and prevention. How do we balance this tension between having to work often within binary categories, particularly when we're engaging men and boys in prevention, while also aiming to challenge these categories and transform how we think about gender? I mean, I quickly looked through it, and there were some really good points in this about language and, even just saying masculinities or femininities, but then also do we say men, women, and, do we extend all of that? So language is a key point to start with, but I'm very curious about
And I guess one of the other things that we touched on in the paper, and I guess acknowledging that challenging and interrogating binaries is one of the hallmarks of gender transformative practice. And we talked about that in terms of both binaries around gender, but other binaries, and the way that we very often fall into the habit of still talking about the norm and the other in a whole lot of areas. And one of the things we talked about is practitioners, I guess, practicing both that self-reflection stuff of constantly checking in on how am I using binaries, how am I interrogating those binaries, how am I challenging myself in terms of the language I use or the examples that I use or how I frame things, but also, I guess, being really conscious of the work that you do of encouraging other people to have those, and I guess we talked about it a bit in terms of being interrogating, so knowing that there's a whole lot of binaries that people cling to and that are quite personal to people, and that people don't necessarily like the idea of saying, well, we're just going to do away with the idea of binaries, that, you know, that's quite confronting for people. But rather than that, really working with people to build their ability to actually stop and reflect on the binaries that they use in their life, whether that's gender or other kind of binaries, and interrogating, well, what does that mean? What happens when I do that? Are there ways that I can push back or change my understandings to start to, I guess, see the world in a less binary way, and to constantly be evolving sort of how we think about people and identity and all of those areas. So I guess that was what we wanted to encourage in the paper, that idea of just constantly being able to interrogate the binaries that we and others use and really unpack what happens when we use those binaries, what power analysis is going on here, who does that include and who does that exclude.
So can I ask, so with binaries, you're actually talking about the categories in which we actually categorise, that process of categorisation?
Yeah, because I mean, we're thinking around both binaries around sex and gender, you know, that often, yeah, you know, and I know that in the work of engaging men and boys, that often, sometimes you rely on using masculinity as a way to engage them, and that automatically plays into the gender binary of that, you know, you're using masculinity and they feel quite engaged by that because they're like, well, that's how I should be, and that's, you know, they essentialise it for themselves, and that's how I'm meant to be, and that's very engaging and a way to get them listening. But then there's that further step, exactly, so around sex category, you know, literally around the way we think about male and female and bodies, and who does that exclude. Yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, because I was thinking of your question in terms of, I guess, migrant communities and the binary of, you know, well, there are Australian men, white men, and then there are other men, the migrant men.
Right.
And I thought, well, how do we actually then distinguish, or how do we do our work or engage with migrant men? And the answer I came up with was not really looking at migrant men, but looking at the migration system, the processes in which we categorise migrant men in that way. So at the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, we intentionally use the words migrant and refugee women. Not that we specifically, or I would specifically identify as being a migrant woman, but it just highlights the point that where our identities are kind of categorised and differentiated through the lens of migration. So if you look at Australia, and I'm just giving a very specific example of how we might break that binary thinking, is that we've come from really a settler state to one that's really market-based in terms of our migration program. So I think it might have been Malcolm Turnbull, I think, who said, you know, our migration program is really like we're a big HR company and we recruit the best, you know. So migrant men really isn't about culture, because culture is represented in a very specific way in our work. So when we do talk about migrant men, it's like, who are we talking about? Are we talking about the 190,000 people who come in on permanent skilled migration visas? Or are we talking about the 1 million plus migrants who come in on temporary visas and who are always kind of shifting from one visa category to the other and don't have full citizenship rights? So I guess it's that process of thinking. That's an example of the process of thinking about breaking that binary, around us and them.
Yeah.
I can talk, Shane, to the gender binary part of this. Shane mentioned Bob Peace's book launch, and he encouraged the audience to do away with this idea of like good men, and we use that, and I really grapple with that. He was introducing this idea of moral selfhood, and so this idea of human virtue, and I think it's a really helpful. I think I'll talk for me. It was a really helpful push for me because this idea of personal threats when you're taking away something. I was chatting to a good friend after Bob's launch, and she said that I love my womanhood. I don't want my womanhood to be taken away. And equally, when we are seeking to engage boys and men, we use Josh Kennedy, Sydney Swans football captain, as one of our ambassadors. And so we're very aware that is reinforcing this idea of what a man is. Yet when he rocks up in a school, you've got the boys. And so it's sort of like this balance between engaging and then using that means of engagement to engage them in a discussion about what do they think it means to be a man. That would arguably be difficult to get them engaged in otherwise. We're using a range of other role models increasingly, and I would love to see a world where we don't need sort of Josh Kennedy, the footballer, to sort of really get young boys excited about this conversation. And so it's tricky, and I think we, the Men's Project, have got a way to go to really resolve some of this stuff.
And that's sorry, Cara.
I was just going to say, I think all the other panellists have covered it really well, but your question itself, balancing the tension, I think that really gets to the point of what this is all about. It's balancing that tension, just considering all of these different components into all of our work that we do whenever we can, and designing our work around it.
Yeah, and I suppose just what you both mentioned, that I think at the launch of Men in Focus, one of the questions that came up from the stakeholders was, so does that mean we should just do away with categories? But like you mentioned, at the same time, these gender categories, even if they're socially constructed, are still very important to people. Also to trans people as well. These categories can be very important. It's not as simple as just breaking it all open and doing away with categories. It's a real challenge.
That's right, and the categories that we identify with are always changing throughout our lifetime. Yeah. So, and just going really forward, man, it just depends. I'm hoping that these young boys may be, in awe of a sports star footy player, at this stage in their life, but 10, 15 years down the track, that may change and be someone else. Yeah. So.
And it's funny, Regina, we the week before last, we had a musician.
Sorry.
You're okay. We had a musician join one of our discussions with boys, and they loved it. And so it was encouraging for us to see a different representation of a role model who could facilitate a conversation like that, and we'll continue to sort of experiment with different ways of engaging them, because I think it would be a shame if it was just that stereotypical sports person,
And I suppose also that crucial to this is to listening to the voices of those that are excluded by the categories and really centering those voices. When I have spoken with stakeholders, particularly in the LGBTI community, there's this feeling alienated by a lot of the resources that we are producing, and so really putting that at the centre and listening and thinking about what do we need to do. And in fact, the LGBTI community will have a lot of those solutions possibly as well for us to think about.
Thanks. Well, let's go to question 3.
It's much less tense than everything. So look, the background to this question is through delivering the masterclass, this was something that came up a lot during the masterclass from practitioners, and people were just really keen to have that discussion around, you know, talking about balancing tension. How do we ensure that our work with men and on masculinity remains accountable to women and keeps human equality at its heart?
Yeah. Yeah, where let's go. I was just going to say, it starts, I think, firstly with men who are working in the space. So, and I know Matt and I speak about this and talk about it, that, you know, that you acknowledge, because what often happens is, as a man working in the space, you receive more praise. Even the research shows this, whereas women receive a lot of backlash and they've been doing the work for decades. So to really acknowledge that history, acknowledge all the work of women and all the women's organisations that have been doing this work, and to be listening to women in the organisations you're working at and saying that you're doing that. Firstly, I think it starts there. I would say.
At VicHealth, I think we're very conscious that masculinity is a new area of work for us, and that we are really being mindful to always make sure that gender equality is the outcomes that we're hoping for with our work. So just keeping that front of mind whenever we're designing any of the work that we're going to go forward and do, being mindful about the fact that gender equality is the outcome we want.
For the leadership of women, ensuring funding goes to women's organisations first, and that doesn't mean that if it goes to women's organisations we don't work with men. We engage men at that governance level. There is that level of accountability built in, and it does make me a really good example of this is my executive director Adele Modolo and I were approached by White Ribbon to work on a research paper on engaging migrant refugee men in prevention activities. And if you know our organisation, we don't work with men. But they said, we think it would be really important if NCWH actually put this research paper together and come up with strategies. And that was being reviewed. And I think that's a really good example of, I guess, an organisation like White Ribbon, men-led, actually taking the initiative to say, no, actually we're not in a position to put this together, we'd like you to do it. And we were paid a small amount to do the paper as well. And that's where it started. So for us, in terms of putting that together, it was more a case, it was strategic advocacy for us, and the process of putting that together in the peer review was quite collegial. And it might have been a little bit controversial, I mean, at the time, because I know that White Ribbon, you know, did have ambassadors going out to promote gender equality. In our paper, we did suggest that it really has to be women that lead these initiatives and formulate these. And ambassadors, like those of the White Ribbon ambassadors at the time, had to be accountable to organisations like ourselves and to women. So one specific example.
I think just building off what Shane said, I think beyond acknowledgement, what we've found helpful is the quality of relationship. Like everything starts with relationship, and so we are in the process of and have built, I think, some really strong relationships with women's health groups, and being, I think, you know, it's more than listening, it's like patience just to have the conversations before jumping into specific projects. And so at the individual level, I think it's just time, and oftentimes that's time that's not funded. But I think it's worthwhile, and then at a structural level, I think it's funders rewarding partnerships with women's health groups, with the family violence sector. I think credit to the Department of Social Services, the Male Role Models grants that were released recently, they were explicit. They said they want partnerships between groups who are working and engaging with men and women's health and family violence groups. And as a result of that, our submission partnered with a number of groups in those sectors. And so I think there's a structural thing here as well in terms of what behaviour funders are rewarding.
And I'm interested, because we've got a little bit of time, in terms of looking at, I guess, how we engage with ideas of masculinity. We know there's a lot more work in that area now, and we all know that a good way of engaging men in talking about masculinities can be through masculinities is harmful, masculinities hurts men. What does a journey look like for, I guess, being able to use that as a tool for engagement, but not losing, not just becoming about this is around improving outcomes for men and losing the equality message?
$1 million question. Definitely in the Men in Focus report, it raises exactly what you said, without the answers so much, but yeah, to really try and think around, and to point out, as you said, that it's absolutely crucial. Because the men will benefit approach can really hijack the whole process in a lot of ways. So I think that's something for us to really think about. What are some of the things that we do at the practitioner level, at the structural level, to ensure that that doesn't become so that we are always bringing it back. And I find when I'm giving presentations or speaking to a media person or whatever, you can say it, you're always saying it and always bring it back to women and need to be accountable to women. It's a key principle. But at the engagement point, is that, can you do it for you, or is it effective? It's really tricky.
I think it's also clear using data where we can to demonstrate the impact of stereotypical masculine norms on women. We know that men who conform to these stereotypical ideas of what it means to be a man, acting tough, conforming to rigid gender roles, this idea of like a man has as many sexual partners as possible, they're 20 times more likely to sexually harass a woman. They're 6 times more likely to use physical violence, including against women. And so when we talk about this work, we foreground that. And so I think that we talk internally at Jesuit Social Services, the order in which you talk about things matters. And so that is sort of what we lead with every time. And yes, these things also have an impact on the mental health of men. Although, interestingly, our work has found the size of those relationships is much smaller than the relationships with sexual harassment and the use of violence.
From a migration perspective, it's when we work with migrant communities, it's talking about people's particular circumstances. So we frame the idea of gender equality as well. In Australia, as with any country, there is a gender and race hierarchy, and there are hierarchies within particular groups as well. And I guess I've been having conversations at work about this, and I can say it because I'm Filipino. I mean, within the Asian groups, there is a hierarchy of Asianness, where Japanese might be top of the tree, and Filipinos down here somewhere. But that hasn't come about because we've internalised it. I mean, this has come about because of geopolitical forces. This is what's happening at the global level. And if you look at the movements of people, where people are migrating for work, where are the migrant workers, this all impacts on people's identity as a man. In terms, because migration really is about moving from one form of gender stratification to another. And it's really looking at, well, how does that impact your life in terms of the gender hierarchy there back in your home country to what it looks now in Australia. And I guess we've all heard the stories about, some particular groups of migrant men might say, our women have it easier here because, of social security benefits, and but it's also about the issues around not being able to find a job or being seen as other and the discrimination that they may face trying to look for employment. let alone being independent as well.
That's fascinating. We're just about at the end. Do you want to add anything more?
Actually, just one more thing that I always think about in relation to this is we talk about single-sex delivery programs or mixed delivery and what it does to have women in the room or women's voices centred in when you are engaging men and boys, but also really conscious of not wanting women to do the labour around educating men and boys all the time. So it's another tension that I think comes up.
Interesting. Well, thanks for that question. Let's go to the next one. Matt, over to you.
Yeah, so I might just give a bit of context this one. So I am increasingly in rooms where there is a acceptance and understanding that stereotypical masculine norms are harmful. They're harmful to women and kids. They're harmful to men. And then I'm also increasingly hearing conversations about healthy masculinities. And while there's less consensus here, I think there is there is a narrative which goes something along the lines of we need to equip our men and boys to be free to choose who they want to be within the bounds of morality and the law. And so we've I think there's increasing awareness of the challenges. There's increasing awareness of where we might want to get to. We work a lot through role models. And so we work through teachers, social workers, sports coaches, people who spend a lot of time with men and boys. Where we're struggling, and there's some exceptions to this. I think there's good evidence around bystander action. There's good evidence around help seeking and what a role model might do to facilitate help seeking. But there's a bunch of areas where there's actually, I haven't seen work which gives us confidence to say to role models, here are the prescriptive set of actions that we recommend you take following our 2-day workshop over the course of the 6 months and beyond to decrease adherence to masculine norms. And that could relate to rigid gender roles, it could relate to hypersexuality, it could relate to asserting control in your relationships. There are these areas where I'm not confident that we've got a really clear understanding of what to enable role models to do next. And that's going to vary by context. And so my question is, I guess, it's not so much what is the answer, although I'd really welcome that. It's more what is the work to determine what are some more sort of prescriptive set of actions or guidance that we can, in this context, enable role models to do after leaving a room that increases their awareness about the impact of gender and masculinities on men and boys.
I think there's a real lack of evaluation of these kind of programs and interventions that are out there, and there's a lot of them that are, they're going mad through the schools, through sports clubs. None of them have, not none, but they've had very limited evaluation, even in the short term, to see what the impacts are, let alone what the long term impacts are. So we don't know what the answer is of what those different actions will work in any setting, really. And that's why, for instance, with the VicHealth framework, it's come down to best practice principles, because we can't yet identify specific actions to take in these programs. And we need more evaluation. So some things that we are funding at the moment is some evaluation of a few programs that are being run in Victoria. Our new Healthier Masculinities grants will also have an external evaluation run alongside them to start to build that evidence, to have a bit more concrete evidence about what does work and what we can keep doing. But yeah, it's not there yet.
Yes, so true. I mean, I saw in the resource it said this, that we have to be okay to try things and fail. It's really tricky, I think, in this climate because everyone wants it to work straight away. And the funding and everything's based on that it works and what is best practice, and that was encouraging to see it, particularly in this area.
And I think one of the things that, if being comfortable to sit in that discomfort, which is something that I guess the women's equality and gender equality movement for, the past however many decades have been getting better at doing, and knowing that, it's really complex social change that we're trying to see happen. Even our ability to measure, are these particular actions going to contribute to this longer term change, is really difficult. But I think it's us being able to say, well, we have a body of evidence that suggests that these kinds of things might be useful. What could that look like? What kind of tools, whether it's giving people a list of specific actions or critical considerations to think about and contextualise to whatever they're doing. I really think of just us having a go at, did this work, and being able to get better at evaluating the story of when people did these actions, what change did they see? Did it have the kind of results that they thought it would? Did it have different results? And then being able to pull that better so that we're better able to refine a clearer sense of what actions could look like. But I think it's a similar space that the violence against women's space, the family violence space, that practitioners are sitting in, of being able to go, we wish we had a checklist, but we also know that the world doesn't work in checklists, so it's us being able to test things, work out why did this work in this particular context, do we think it's being more useful than harmful, we can share that with people and then people can contextualise it. So that's a bit of a nothing answer, but I think it is that sense of being able to have a go at things and be okay with the discomfort of not actually having a clear set of rules for us all to work from.
Sitting in the discomfort because I'm looking at that question. I just wanted to, so I guess in the absence of evaluations at the moment, we're still waiting for evidence to come through. What do we do? And I thought maybe we take a step back, and Matt, maybe you might be able to answer this question too in relation to that. What is it, how we're conceptualising harmful or toxic masculinities? Because that may form part of the answer, because I know there have been critiques around using toxic masculinity, because then if there's a toxic masculinity, there's a healthy one. And again, that's the binary that I think we should try and get out of thinking, because toxic masculinities to some people may be that it's a characteristic of particular men that we think if we just sent them off to education camps, they'd be able to get rid of that toxins from their body. Whereas, as we know, it kind of it's a social, cultural, economic, political economy of the world that we live in that contributes to that harmful masculinity. So I'm thinking, what we do know is we know so much about the social and cultural conditions already in terms of inequality. So we really should be focusing or framing our efforts around those issues. Perhaps, the breadwinner kind of model is a good one to start off with. Or if we're looking at, hypersexuality, what's happening, in terms of pornography, we know that young men are watching it as young as 12 now. What are we doing around regulations around, social media? So I guess, yes, I'm thinking out loud. So more, instead of focusing on the toxic masculinities, what do we do know in our current kind of political, social, cultural conditions that actually buttress that and actually make that even worse?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. That's helpful. And when we talk to this work, we actually, for better or worse, and there's debates about this, we don't use the term toxic masculinities. We do talk about pressure to adhere to stereotypical masculine norms because it invites a conversation about context over time and context related to culture. And what we're seeking, like a good result for us from an evaluation perspective would be that men feel like they've got more choice as to how they behave in a particular situation. And so that might be, a lot of our workers work with people in prison, and that might be that someone in prison chooses to act tough because that is entirely adaptive and necessary in that context, or else they're going to be unsafe. But we talk about sort of promoting choice, I guess. We get a little stuck on what that means for like how to facilitate that. And some of your comments have been helpful. I wonder, Shane, I just want to come back to the pressure to do this now. I worry a little bit that, come the end of the fourth action plan, so move forward to sort of 2022, that there'll be increasing impatience for this work. And I wonder whether any of you, I'm conscious of time, so guide us, whether you have any reflections on how we can promote patience. I know Change the Story talks about sort of generational shifts, but I wonder if there's any other sort of ideas on how to promote patience and avoid a situation where we're saying, well, let's cease the funding that's currently supporting some of this work.
That our work doesn't happen in isolation to a lot of other conditions. So I think we just have to say, well, it's not as if we're doing gender equality people work here, and issues around sustainability and the gig economy and the Uberisation of our life and work and love is over here. They're all mashed together. Yeah.
I think also on that point, even we still have to articulate what primary prevention is.
Yeah.
because some of the books that have been released or some of the discourses that are emerging at the moment are critiquing, say, someone like Our Watch or Change the Story, and they're looking at it through a response lens or an early intervention lens, and it's not actually about primary prevention. So it's about articulating there's a piece of it and exactly what it is, and that they all have to work together, that we still have to do that a lot of the time, and that's really important to do from the outset.
That's great. Well, you can tell that question got people going. Let's finish up with Cara's question.
So mine's kind of getting at what I've mentioned a couple of times about language. We really struggle with how to frame this work to get people on board, even sometimes internally, to get people on board with the work that we're doing to progress gender equality through using a men and masculinities approach, and particularly recognising that at VicHealth we work with a lot of sports clubs and workplaces that don't have all of this background into what primary prevention is and the outcomes that we're seeking for. So how do we engage these sectors without alienating them with hegemonic masculinity and gender transformative practice and patriarchy? How do we get them on board?
I think it's a really good question. And one of the things that I was thinking about, one of the other hats that I wear is as a writer, and I write novels, and one of the things that we always talk about in the world of fiction is showing, not telling. And this got me thinking about that, I guess, in terms of this question, in terms of, in looking at what is useful for people, it's not necessarily to have the jargon, but it's useful to know what the jargon is talking about. So being able to show people when we talk about something like patriarchy or hegemonic masculinity, what does that actually look like? What does that look like for you in the world that you live in, the organisations that you work in? Sometimes, one of the games that I like to play with friends is we play Patriarchy Spotto, where you'll sort of be able to go, there's patriarchy, look at that patriarchy happening over there. But it's a way of actually being able to show, this is what this actually looks like for us as people who exist in the world and have relationships and go to work and, you know, have different forms of influence. So for me, it's often about, rather than bombarding people with the language or the frameworks or any of that kind of conceptual stuff that we as workers use and depend on, it's being able to show people what that looks like and how it's meaningful for them, so that they're able to then identify whether or not they want to use the language. They're able to identify, this is how I'm actually part of that conversation and potentially how I can be part of that change.
At MCWH, we use what we call a woman-to-woman approach in our multilingual education sessions, and I think that comes to the heart of it as well. So by not telling, by actually allowing people to tell their own story in their own words, for us that is, I guess, the most, storytelling is the most kind of democratic acts that you can do, because only you have that story, only you can tell it. We can't tell it for you, but we facilitate that discussion and frame it in a way that will make gender equality more meaningful. Yeah. And definitely don't use the word intersectionality or hegemonic masculinity.
Yeah. Something that you said, show, go, tell, and Cara, you mentioned before, there's a ton of work going on in this space. What astounds me a little bit is, while there's a ton of work going on in this space, we actually don't know a lot about what men and boys think about some of these constructs. And so something we're encouraging, schools, but sports clubs as well to do, is invest the time up front to ask the boys, oftentimes in the context we're in, what do they think about some of this stuff? We've just got data in from 1,100 boys from an all-boys school, and it really surprised the teachers what they found. They thought they'd sort of got on top of some of the homophobia attitudes related to homophobia, and they haven't. It's sort of over half of the boys would be embarrassed to have a lot of gay friends. And so anchoring this work in the reality of where men and boys are at, and then using that to sort of ground the work in the context that that the folks you're working with are in, rather than talking in generalities or just doing sort of general activities which aren't anchored to the specifics of where folks are at, I think is one bit of it. I think the second bit of it is, to the extent possible, and there's a role for this, but to the extent possible, avoiding one-off sessions. We're seeing, I think, increasingly, particularly in schools, but elsewhere too, one-off sessions are increasing. And what I'm hearing from teachers and others is that they're then not always enabled to sort of do the follow-up. And there's got to be some folks there that are equipped with the theoretical underpinning that guides this work. And so it doesn't have to be explicit. We don't have to use terms like intersectionality, hegemonic masculinity with some of our audience, but equally there's got to be some folks who can carry the work with that theoretical grounding. And I don't think one-off sessions really facilitate that. I think oftentimes it's sort of like the circus comes, the circus leaves, and then there's nothing to really anchor the work and drive the work forward.
I think another challenge, I guess, that sits alongside that is the media and the portrayals of the media. We always see that talks about masculinity, how that is very poorly received. So that broader public perception of this work, it's not helped by that. So when I get the concept of using stories and showing, if you have the time to do that and to work with, but if you're trying to get something in the first place and they're not on board,
I can have a go. It sort of goes a little bit to where we've had success has been one of two things. It's been either, and I'm going to speak super frankly, it's been either like star power, so like bringing a Tim Winton, bringing a Josh Kennedy, bringing someone like a rapper, and so using that as a means to get folks excited, Alternatively, it's been working with one or two really enthusiastic people at an organisation and equipping them over the course of a number of months to then lead the conversation with their colleagues. And so it's kind of like a slickie. It's like get a little bit and then get them to get others, and then like it flips over. But it's just time. That takes time. And so we are now just starting. We hindsight's 2020. We should have done this like 18 months ago. Just starting to use a validated readiness assessment to get a gauge of where an organisation is at and how ready they are for change before we start working with them in any sort of intensive way. So actually putting effort into understanding where, if it's a principal who's wanting to lead change, where their colleagues are at before jumping in, I think is pretty important before commencing the work.
Yeah, I suppose just what you said, firstly the one-off thing, I can't believe since the launch a few weeks ago I've been asked to go to speak to banks on the energy sector and the police, and it's like just for one, just for an hour, and it's like these need very tailored kinds of responses, and and that seems to be the flavour at the moment so that's definitely being an issue. But think about healthier masculinities and looking at the lit review, and that in itself has been a strategy around language, I suppose, for engaging men and boys, and there is this consensus that perhaps this is the language to use, when really it's about encouraging men and boys to be all the things that we consider feminine or unmanly as well, but we don't call it that. Yeah. So there's something in language, and perhaps healthier masculinities is, but still something to think about and keep pushing and challenging, and who does it exclude, etc.
Exactly. And that's where we are as VicHealth at the moment, is that healthier masculinities was the consensus in language to use when we started our consultation 18 months ago. And over that time, it has progressed to a point where we didn't even know what to call the framework a couple of weeks ago, because the tide has turned on whether that's the right language to use or not. And that's a real challenge, I think. So alongside this work, we're also doing some values-based messaging work to try to determine how the general public perceives the different ways that you potentially use language, and how they respond to those messages. Right, healthier masculinities compared to, I can't remember what the other options were, but not using masculinities in there at all. And that's a real challenge that I guess we're struggling with.
And I think also to bring just kind of parallel to this, that we can all have a role to play outside our formal work, because we have a chance to speak to family and friends, and Christmas is coming up, and I don't suggest you start a Christmas conversation. But I always have a game that I play every time we have family gatherings, because there'll always be someone that says, "Oh, so what are you doing at the moment?" And I'm forced to, I cannot use the language, or I have my 80-year-old mother, and I can share this, who says, "Why are all these women coming out now, about the Epstein affair?" And I can't say anything. I leave it up to my 17-year-old to say, "Tell grandma what we talk about." It's difficult, but I think we can kind of work out our intersectional kind of advocacy muscle in that way with family and friends, and it is really challenging to get out of work speak and actually then try, boy by boy or man by man, to try and inform and engage them in the work that we do professionally.
That's great. Well, thank you all for that. That was really interesting conversation. Lorraine's going to make a few comments.
We're having a Q&A too.
Oh, yes.
We have 10 minutes for a Q&A from you, and I'm going to make some comments either before or after that, or in between all that. I found it, I'll start, and while I talk, you generate some key questions to really make this happen. Thank you all. Those were great questions, and great answers actually, and really provocative. I guess I have a few observations. I'm struck by how much we've just talked about men and boys. And that it is a preoccupation. I know it's one of the key tenets of GT, gender transformative work, that issue of engaging men and boys. But you know, it's a hurdle. You know, I can hear it, especially from the men over here and the women over here. It is a hurdle, and there are lots of issues in it that are, I'd say, stumbling blocks, if you will, that relate to your questions in a variety of ways. But I think the questions themselves can be extrapolated. Just want to go through some of the issues that came to me. I'm going to start with the last discussion, actually, because it struck me that we can think about GT as a process that happens incrementally, person by person, in any situation, including the Christmas dinner with your mother. And almost any topic can provoke a reaction from us. So I do think that's a really important point, that this is, you know, stepping back, the basic problem that's causing us to think about GT in the first place is that we are swimming in an ocean of gendered tropes of a variety of kinds that either constrain us or free us or hurt us or something. And that's what we're reacting against. So it seems to me, since we're all fish in that sea, we all have a role to play in changing it. So I think that's really interesting. And I think it also moves into what you actually do when you've got a bunch of boys in a high school in front of you. Because I think you can appeal to them as individuals as well as a collective. You know, I'm thinking that we might want to resurrect consciousness raising as well here. That there is a role for men to do this for themselves, not just to have this done to them or with them. And I'm thinking back to, you know, the emergence of the second and third wave women's movements, where this was a key element. You do it for yourself. And so, you know, riffing on that a little bit and going back to some of the earlier questions, I think it's kind of interesting to think about consciousness raising, and in so doing, how we can facilitate that. How we can facilitate men and boys, and I'm going to come to women and girls in a minute, to become critical thinkers about their own lives. And I'm just going to go all over the place, because when you said, you know, we don't have evaluative data, so it's hard to prove X worked and get the next piece of funding. In some ways, we have to not only resist those boxes, but maybe change what we're measuring and say, maybe what we want to measure here is not did the application of program X change this bunch of boys into something different, but maybe we want to say, did we influence the way they think about themselves? Did we influence the level of skill they might have in being critical thinkers about the ocean they swim in? And maybe that's what we want. And it's less important to say, did this program have this desired effect? And you know, we've done that in a lot of health issues, challenge the evaluation model that people are expecting us as funders to perform against. And I don't think we should forget that we've got some agency there. So let's talk about girls, women. You know, when we talk about the patriarchy, going back to question one, my question is, where is the matriarchy in all of this? And what do we think about? When we talk about toxic masculinity, my question is, where is toxic femininity in all of this? And why don't we think about it or talk about it? And how do these things consort with each other to create this ocean? And you know, we like asking questions. I do anyway. I don't necessarily have the answers. But toxic femininity and the matriarchy are things that I'm going to turn my attention to way more now. Because coming to the tenets of GT, we have engaging men and boys, we have empowering women and girls. Well, I think maybe we need to do both with both now. Because
challenge, I'm so sorry. I'm really Shane and Matt know me. I work at Project Momentum, which is the other only male-funded program, and it's a grassroots community mobilisation of men that gathers them and trains them to then go on and do smaller community-based. It is conscious raising, community-based projects. Sorry, I've been sitting here going, oh my gosh, I've got so many answers. Well, so many attempts. We've tested so many things. The things that you've just brought up is exactly what we've been evaluating. We don't have role models, we don't have ambassadors, we're training them in allyship. They've learned that they know less than what they knew when they first came into that training space. And we have taken on patriarchy quite openly, they own it. But also what we did at the same time was I created a women's accountability panel so that the men had to present their ideas to a panel of women. The first learnings in that project was that women are not comfortable giving their opinions to men, which is exactly what you were saying, because I've always been, well, in this space, if we have, not that I use that same language, toxic masculinity, where is femininity and all of this? When have we risen and not risen? Where have we been at some fights and perhaps not at others? I had to train the women in becoming accountability panellists. They were extremely uncomfortable, and we had to mentor them as well. Each ally has a female expert. They're not paired with women. They're paired with a female expert of their idea. So, for example, we did the Man Box Story Project. 7 men from the community came and wrote stories about how a real magazine impacted their life. And it was a female author that was their key expert. And so as they've gone on, we also did the first ever female umpire training project. I was summoned to AFL House over that. They couldn't believe that there was somebody who gets paid a lot of money each year to do community stuff, and some social worker in a first year undergrad had sort of fixed it. So we're looking at working with them to make it permanent, just to make it purely about female umpires. So we had about 5 very senior women within AFL, so football, Australian rules. And yeah, I have a model now. We have people that want to follow it, and it's including all of that stuff.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that.
So we are doing it, and it's happening, and yeah, we just need more support to continue it, because everything that everyone's saying, we've been, for the last 12 months, trying to make it happen.
That's excellent, and I think implicitly then you're addressing so many of these other questions that are embedded in what we're talking about. There are comments on that. I'm just going to make one last one before we open this up to the whole room, but are there any comments on the last statement? So let's just talk about the binary. It seems to be kind of a good thing and a bad thing, right? I mean, this is one of the other goals, it's implicit, is whatever, I forget what I said in the book, smashing it. It was probably irresponsible, but rattling it. Because I think we have to say, and I think transgender activist movements have made us think about gender identity more and differently. So I think we have to say there's something about gender identity that is either comforting and essential to people, or a cage at the same time, and or both at once. And so maybe it's time to get a little bit more subtle about what we want to do with the binary. We face this problem in our work in a lot of specific ways, especially in women's health, where people often want us to maybe focus more generally on humans or people or individuals as opposed to women, boys, girls, men, transgender people, gender diverse people, intersex people. And I think we've got to push our thinking way more on this one into recognizing what might be part of someone's identity that is comforting. And I think one of you mentioned a proud part of a person's life, right? Whether you're male or female or transgender, there may be a real utility to that we do not want to undermine or destroy in people. On a practical level, when we're delivering health improvement programs or health promotion or interventions, we also have to be realistic. 99.5% of the population identify with being either a woman or a man or a boy or a girl. It's meaningful, and we need to react to that. It doesn't mean that we're exclusive at all. It means we need to learn about how to think through the next frontier here, whether that's a third space, as we talked about yesterday, or what it is. I don't know. We need to think about that more and recognize what's both good and bad about the categories, because that's all the binaries are. It's about the categories that serve to limit us. Are there pieces of those categories that actually free us as well? And this comes to the third tenet of GT, and that is undermining stereotypes, which is much of what we've talked about this morning. How do we do that across all gender spaces? It may be useful to think about negative gender stereotypes in all gender spaces. And we'll be doing a lot more of this tomorrow in our discussions. And by the way, we're writing a workbook right now, which has really been challenging, to go with the book, Gender Unchained, to try and be more provocative on some of these questions for ourselves. But I think, you know, when we look at all three of these things, engaging men and boys, it's a big preoccupation, which makes us think sometimes that we just haven't done enough of it anyway, and that's why it's such a preoccupation right now, because it's still novel. And no, we don't know how to do it all that well sometimes, or we don't know how to measure it, or men don't know how to hear it, or whatever. But empowering women, there are some lessons to be learned from that we need to bring in. Maybe we need to empower men, odd as that might sound, and engage women in this work. But I think the stereotype thing, it crosses all gender categories. If we're interested in eliminating the limits of stereotypes, we have to talk about that with every gender group, all of the time, now and in the future. So let's open it up. Questions for any of these people? Give them harder things to know. Yes, please.
Hi. I have a question. Thank you for the discussion. It was really interesting. I have a question on something that Shane mentioned briefly. You talked about the good man idea. Oh, was it? Maybe you did. Somebody did. Somebody mentioned the idea of the good man and how that's problematic. I really can't stand the term. I have huge problems with it, but I haven't heard it unpacked in a formal space. I still often hear it used in a number of different spaces, including feminist spaces or spaces to around gender equality. So I guess I just wanted to know, are there more formal conversations happening specifically around that term? And what are they? And if not, should they be, and how?
I mean, definitely in the research, there is a lot of this discussion around avoiding the good man, bad man narrative for various reasons, but above all, that it really isn't intersectional at all, and that in the systems of power that we're working within, we can pretty much see who are going to be targeted as the bad men and who will be privileged as the good men. So that is a key, problem with it, really. So definitely in the research, there is a lot of debate. Well, not really debate, but a lot of consensus around avoiding that narrative. The first point is that it just doesn't think about the differential relations, the power amongst men, and how they are positioned differently within our structures and systems of power.
And it's a binary.
It's a binary, yeah, and it's a hierarchy, as all binaries are. But the problem with the binary is the hierarchy that we put on it. Yeah.
Matt?
I was just going to ask, where do you struggle with it? Like, why do you not like it?
Yeah, so my struggle, this might be controversial, is that the idea, particularly around the way I define good man, is someone who has his balance and someone who hasn't. And I struggle with it, with the idea of acknowledging that obviously people can change, but also people then don't acknowledge or are less, it's more of a struggle then to get people to own their violence or assault if they're going to be put in these categories. And then also the idea that, there was another one and it was really great, but I've forgotten it. And I know that's all controversial and wanting to hold people to account, but I just think there's so many more nuances, and having those strict, the third one, and then potentially good men who may never have used violence, not being able to acknowledge how they potentially are contributing to, negative, reinforcing negative power structures, etc. So I don't find it very helpful because it's a way for people to either defend various camps or resist various camps.
And again, it's like the rigidity of the terms, and therefore the containers is what the problem is. And it takes us away from acknowledging that within all of us, we'll have an array of attitudes and norms and practices that may or may not contribute to differing degrees to the problem, even if we're not labeled as the problem. And I think my earlier comments about, where's the femininity and the masculinity, where's the matriarchy, like where is the giant system that is perpetuating all of this? It is not to erase power differentials at all, but just to say what is that other piece that's consorting with the original piece that we're so critical of, and how do we do that? How do we move through by that sort of internalization of consciousness in everybody? It's a generational problem, no doubt. Maybe we have time for one last question, do we? Yes.
So a little bit of a statement start, but there is a question. So it's about patriarchy, and it kind of connects to the last question and the first one. So firstly, in terms of use of the word, I just think we shouldn't be shying away from it, and I think it's about how you use it and when you use it and who uses it. So I think about a tweet that Darcy Bessio did, a footballer, a young woman footballer, who did a tweet with one of the supporters. It was a selfie with this young girl, and they said, when you're smiling together because you're going to slash the patriarchy, and it went completely viral. And it had people, dads saying, I want my daughter to have these opportunities. So, I think there are places for language, and we need to just not be too tiptoey around it. I also think in terms of the first question, we've just been doing some work around violence prevention for LGBTI people, and certainly one of the conclusions we're coming through with that research, which is just one of them, is that the whole stuff around patriarchy is as important in that space as it is in dealing with men's violence against women, because we do all face those stereotypes. Everyone, regardless of your gender, your gender identity, your sexuality, deals with the same patriarchal systems. And patriarchal systems, by definition, are about power and control. And so I think that's been a really important thing. There's evidence in the literature that shows that people who adhere to those who think patriarchal systems are good and adhere to those traditional forms, ideas about masculinity, are more likely, for example, to be homophobic. And so my question was actually in terms of literature review and work that other people have done, whether you have found evidence about connections to other systems of oppression like racism. So, are people who are, supportive of traditional masculinities, and saying traditional, I'm not sure now where we're going with that language, but whether there are connections to other kind of support other forms of oppression as well.
Yeah. I suppose just I might speak on the homophobia, the connection with gender and sexuality, and just absolutely that compulsory heterosexuality has been central to masculinity, and in order to fit into and to be read as straight, you have to do your masculinity well and be read as masculine, and that they go together. And that a key part of, that often in the literature we see that sexism and homophobia go together as a result, for sure.
Yeah.
But perhaps around race and ethnicity, there's a lot of connections there too.
Yeah, so I guess the rationale for that first question was really, yes, definitely we need to use it, patriarchy, and continue to use it, only because I think people then start conflating, when you start unpacking patriarchy, then it does take you down homophobia, racism.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to end, Lorraine, because you said maybe we should be having a look at toxic femininities. I don't think we should. I really think if patriarchy is a dominant form that we're grappling with at the moment, I think the spotlight should be, front and centre, looking at patriarchy, looking at patriarchal systems. Because we've already, in terms of, it's almost making femininity and feminisms a little bit accountable to, what we're doing in the work in terms of smashing the patriarchy. But I think, we've got a lot of work to do in trying to understand and unpack what we mean. I mean, it's really easy to smash patriarchs, but the patriarchy itself, I think, it's embedded, it's going to be there for a long time, and I think we really need to be at the coalface, chipping away, every moment opportunity that we do get. So,
I couldn't agree more. But there might be another coalface, that's the only point I'm making. Any final comments before lunch? Yes, one.
I'll keep it quick because I know people are hungry. So, like most of my practice is, both practice and research is in relation to adolescent women and also adolescent women's experiences of intimate partner violence, and that's both in social work and criminology. But when we talk about toxic femininities, which is like the strange part of the work, like we talk about, because the binary that women experience counter-exists to the binaries that men experience, but when we see the discourse of how that plays out, a lot of that things, it seems like docility or like internalized misogyny, it's like social capital, of navigating that sort of patriarchal system.
That's
I'm speaking in relation to adolescents, like in adolescent development. So I think it's kind of how we reframe some of that as well. Like in terms of, and particularly for young people where they tend to socially police each other because of adolescent development and social referencing. So it's kind of just being able to look at those sorts of behaviours in context to how they actually sit with problematic patriarchal behaviours playing out within those situations.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. Okay, it's lunchtime.
It is lunchtime. So thank you to our panel.